2022 is finally coming to a close. It's been a very rough year for a lot of us, and let's face it, 2023 probably isn't going to be that much better. So, as a Christmas treat, I thought that we could end the year with a bang, with not one, but two of the most requested Mad Lads. The world of organised crime is a lot like a fraternal order in many ways. After all, the Italian mobs are literally called families. When you have such a dangerous secret life, it stands to reason that you'll form a sort of brotherly connection with some of your closest associates, because they're the only ones you can properly trust, and all of your lives depend on all of you having each other's back. And if you're in deep enough, you are often also bound by blood. But what happens if the blood connection is a bit more literal? What happens when a pair of criminals burst onto the scene that really were family? How dangerously effective could the synergy of such a brotherhood be when they are actually brothers? Well, prepare for trouble. Make it double. I'm sorry, I couldn't help myself. The Krays twins. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, it is in fact your boy, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid has transformed gaming on the move to provide you with the ultimate portable handheld experience. With over 80 million other players, you will conquer raids, dungeons, campaign battles and bosses to build up your champions along the way and take part in my personal favourite mode, the PvP Arena. In addition, there are hundreds of artifacts and buffs with over 650 unique champions to choose from, and the list is growing, so you can play however way you want. I like my games to be actively in development, and Raid is always adding new content, whether it is items or champions to earn or new challenges and modes. I love the competition of the PvP arena as well, and Raid guarantees that I have something to do and it is constantly putting out something big to be involved in. Also, having so many champions means that the modularity of builds is almost endless. Raid has prepared something special for all new players this Christmas, which will be the celebration of the 12 days of Raid. Download Raid from the links in the description, copy your player ID from in-game, and then go to 12daysofraid.plarium.com, enter your player ID, and start a fun, festive adventure that lasts 12 days, running from December the 19th to January the 10th. Each day, experience a new chapter of this wintry story and play a new mini-game for a chance to win some amazing in-game and real-life prizes, including holiday-themed Raid champions and even Amazon gift cards worth up to $1,000. And for existing Raid players, you can head to 12daysofraid.plarium.com, where you can find a special holiday promo code that everyone can use for a small festive gift. On top of that, Raid has got something else happening now. They've released a legendary champion based off of MMA and pro wrestling legend Ronda Rousey. You can get Ronda for free right now, whether you're a new or long-time player, just by logging into Raid. All you've got to do is log in and play Raid for 7 days between now and February the 20th, and Ronda is all yours. That's all there is to it. Use my link in the description down below to download Raid for free on your phone or PC. To celebrate Ronda's arrival in Raid, you can use the special promo code RAIDRONDA to get a bunch of helpful stuff like a 3-day 100% XP booster, 500,000 silver, and 5 full energy refills. Perfect for leveling Ronda up so she is at the top of her game. This code is for old and new players. Also, if you are an Amazon Prime member, you can claim exclusive rewards now. So if you want a starting boost in Raid Shadow Legends, hit the link down below or scan the QR code on the screen to get unique bonuses worth $30. That's 200,000 silver, an XP booster, an energy refill, an ancient shard, and the epic champion Vergis, so you can summon a great champion as soon as you get into the game. These rewards are only available to new players and only for the next 30 days, and you can find these rewards here in your inbox. Ronald and Reginald Kray were born on the 24th of October 1933 in East London, with Reggie getting a 10-minute head start over his brother. After sharing a womb, it soon turned out that the twins also shared a face, though you could tell them apart pretty easily by their temperament. The young Reggie was a lot more outgoing than Ronnie, who grew up a bit of a loner and preferred the company of his German Shepherd as he explored the ruins of old buildings that had been bombed during the war. The boy's dad, Charles Sr., wasn't around very much. Surprise, surprise, because he was busy working as a travelling salesman of second-hand clothes, whilst also being on the run for dodging the draft into World War II. Why are the recurring themes of pretty much every mad lad feds and daddy issues? It's weird that, isn't it? But anyway, the boy's mother, Violet, more than compensated for their father's absence, and she had a reputation in the neighbourhood as a fiercely protective matriarch. So protective that her home became known as Fort Valence, after its location on Valence Road. With such a strong matriarch keeping most of them together, the Kray family were really, really close. Maybe a little bit too close, because you see, the Kray twins might have been joined at the hip in more ways than one. Allegedly, I really want to stress the word allegedly here, right? I just want to get this part out of the way because this is some stuff that only just recently came out. Apparently one of the Kray twins confessed it to their cellmate, blah blah blah. I don't know if it's true, no one does. The tabloids will print fucking anything, but allegedly the teenage Krays fucked each other to keep their homosexuality a secret. Now, I'm not sure if I actually believe that, and to be honest, you know what, I don't actually believe that, but unfortunately, people would probably get mad if I didn't discuss it in the video. It just sounds a little bit ridiculous, to be honest. But the Kray twins were certainly very, very close, and they remained inseparable throughout their entire lives. However, incest wasn't the only fatherless behaviour that went on with the Kray twins, because they actually saw the police at their home a lot more than their own dad, due to the fact that they spent so much of their time committing petty crimes, like falling in with the local gangs and also getting into fights in between shifts at the local fish market that they worked at. And they only worked there for about 6 months, and that was the longest time that any of them ever managed to hold down a normal job. Despite their father's absence, the Kray twins didn't go completely without a role model, as they were inspired by their bare-knuckle boxer granddad, a man named Jimmy Cannonball Lee. The teenage Kray twins became amateur boxers, and they were so dedicated that they reportedly made a pact with each other, saying that they would either become boxers or villains. In the business, you know how it goes. Ronnie was the more ferocious of the two, but Reggie went on to be the better fighter, because he used his head more. And, as Eddie Hall found out the hard way, technique matters a lot more than just brute strength. Nevertheless, both twins were solid fighters, and Reggie even won some tournaments, such as the 1948 Hackney Schoolboy Boxing Championship. He even had the potential to go pro. However, while the Kray twins had developed a real talent for fighting, they didn't learn any of the associated discipline that came with it. In 1950, they pulled a West Side Story and they attacked a rival gang outside of a dance hall, which got them hauled before the Old Bailey for the first time, though the charges were ultimately dropped due to a lack of evidence. However, despite having managed to keep their criminal record clean, the Krays' boxing career wouldn't last much longer. The Krays had to hang up their gloves because duty called as they came of age in 1951, when they were sent to do their national service with the Royal Fusiliers. However, they almost immediately went AWOL and assaulted a corporal. which led to them being among the last prisoners ever held in the Tower of London, as they waited for their transfer to military prison and then, following their dishonourable discharge, regular prison. After having completely shirked their duty to Queen and country, did the Krays settle down and patiently wait for their release? No, they did not. Instead, they passed the time by pulling shit like stealing a set of handcuffs and cuffing a guard to the bars of their cell, and other things, including setting their own beds on fire and also dumping a latrine bucket over a sergeant. But while I'm sure the Krays had a lot of fun, unfortunately all of this chicanery left the Krays with a criminal record, which meant that they couldn't go back to boxing once they were released. With their one chance of using their powers of violence for good squandered, the delinquent duo needed to do something with themselves. So they consulted their idols for guidance. After all, it's completely natural to want to follow in the footsteps of your heroes. Unfortunately, the Krays had grown up in the 1940s, and they sure as hell weren't going to become hard-boiled detectives. So they were left with only one cultural influence: gangsters. The Krays absolutely loved gangsters, especially one by the name of Billy Hill, who controlled Soho in the 1950s, and he lived it up lavishly and in style, which heavily influenced how the Kray twins would go on to quite literally tailor their image. Hill would even become a mentor to the Krays as he went into retirement. The Krays dove headfirst into a life of crime by setting up a protection racket and committing robberies and arson, while regularly going out for a punch-up down the pub with the boys, because the Krays loved a good scrap. Soon enough, their penchant for violence paid off handsomely, and the Krays were doing well enough that they were able to use the revenue from their misdeeds to set up a legitimate enterprise. But fast food chicken joints weren't due to arrive in the UK until a decade later, so they had to make do by taking over a run-down billiard hall called the Regal. However, while the new base of operations was a great feather in the fledgling Krays cap, it drew the attention of their new rivals. Later that year, members of a Maltese gang tried to shake the Kray twins down for protection money, and Ronnie immediately sorted them out with a cutlass. Like a cutlass, an actual cutlass. He carved them up with a literal pirate sword, firmly establishing that these new upstarts were not to be fucked with, in swashbuckling fashion. This was the first of many acts of violence that helped the Kray twins establish a fearsome reputation very quickly. But while the twins looked the same, they were perceived a little differently, with Reggie being the more calculating, smart and charismatic of the two, and Ronnie coming across a lot more volatile, thuggish, and generally a lot more unstable. However, while this assessment is accurate, it sells the twins a little short. While each twin has his own forte and often literally carved out the broad strokes of their criminal enterprise in different ways, such as Ronnie repeatedly committing acts of violence and Reggie essentially using marketing to turn that violence into clout, in true brotherly fashion, the Krays shared everything, including skills. While Reggie was more calculating than his brother, that doesn't mean that he wasn't also a maniac that could dish out a lot of pain. He even had his own secret fighting move called the cigarette punch, in which he would pretend to put a cigarette in the target's mouth and then punch them while their mouth was open, catching them by surprise and making it easier to break their jaw. And the fact that Ronnie was less outgoing than his brother didn't mean that he didn't want his share of the spotlight. He had spent his whole life dreaming about being at the top of his own empire, of which he was indisputably in charge. But while he and Reggie were putting in the work to make that dream come true, Ronnie didn't do himself any favours. In 1956, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for slicing up a man named Terence Martin with a bayonet, and then knocking him out with his bare hands. As you can probably tell, Ronnie also had a very diverse collection of weapons that included knuckle dusters, a Mauser pistol, and crossbows. While Ronnie was away, it didn't take very long for him to be declared insane. Shocking, I know. And he was transferred to a secure mental hospital. While he was there, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and he was described as a simple man of low intelligence, poorly in touch with the outside world. Naturally, Ronnie wasn't very happy with his surroundings, so he hatched a plan. One Sunday, Reggie came to visit Ronnie. Reggie was wearing a raincoat, and Ronnie was wearing a blue suit. The two brothers and a friend chatted away until the twin in the raincoat left, apparently to get some tea. 20 minutes later, a nurse asked the Kray in the blue suit where his brother had went, only to realise that she was talking to Reggie, who had given his coat to Ronnie, who then used it to slip out undetected. You know, there's perks of being twins. And despite being questioned by the cops, Reggie got away with it because, and I quote, "It's not as if we actually done anything. We've been sitting here waiting for a cup of tea that never came." Despite having fucking parent-trapped his way to freedom, Ronnie was not having a good time of things while laying low. He'd started drinking very heavily, which made a really bad combination with his medication, which led to him spiralling out of control and attempting suicide. Ronnie was in such a bad way that Reggie had to do the unthinkable to save his life. Call the cops. After all, who better to keep an eye on him? Soon after being picked up, Ronnie was declared sane enough to serve the rest of his sentence at Wandsworth Jail. However, Ronnie's absence didn't put much of a damper on the brothers' aspirations. While he was away, Reggie was very productive. He was more than ready to enter the big leagues, and all of the pieces were moving into place. He had the clout, the money, the willpower, and the knack for extreme violence. But you can't be much of a gangster without a gang, can you? So, Reggie sought out some like-minded maniacs and established the Firm. But they were all of them deceived, for another Kray was involved. Despite the twins being the face of the business, their older brother Charlie did a lot of work with them behind the scenes, including helping Reggie acquire and spruce up the Krays' first nightclub. Opening on the 6th of May 1957, the Double R brought the glamour and decadence of the West End to the East End, complete with a cabaret stage, a gym, and even a boxing ring. But that wasn't all it brought. As the first of many instances of the Krays using their dirty money to fund legitimate businesses, the Double R was to be the new base of operations for the Firm. You could call it the capital of the Krays' criminal empire. However, the Emperor's return wasn't quite as triumphant as he had hoped. In 1959, Ronnie left prison not only a lot more unstable than when he first went in, but also noticeably heavier. After all, he was eating for two now. Did you get it? Schizophrenia joke. But while the twins were no longer so identical, Ronnie still got to live his lifelong dream of being the boss of his own empire, in which he was known by his underlings as the Colonel. And he and Reggie both took a very hands-on approach to conducting business. Perhaps a little too hands-on. On one occasion, Ronnie allegedly branded a jewel thief with a white-hot poker for breaking the nose of one of his men. Both Krays were very often in and out of prison for their litany of crimes, but their operation was so solid that their absences barely made any difference. Though they seemed to be at their most productive when the increasingly unhinged Ronnie was behind bars and Reggie and Charlie could sell as much china as possible before the bull came back. In February of 1960, while Reggie was on bail pending a racketeering case, the twins made a very lucrative deal with a slumlord named Peter Rackman. Ronnie had already sunk his claws into Rackman, having had his rent collectors and enforcers beaten to a pulp after their first protection check bounced. So, Rackman was very keen to get the Krays off his back for good. So, instead of paying protection, he would give them a nightclub turned casino in Knightsbridge that was named Esmeralda's Barn, which helped greatly with expanding the Krays' influence into the West End of London. Gambling had just been legalised, and Esmeralda's Barn was one of the first casinos to open in London, making it an instant hit. Not only was the place a new frontier in the Krays' territory, but it was also the breadbasket of their criminal empire, from whence came all the riches. If the double R was the Krays' Rome, then Esmeralda's Barn was their Alexandria. In addition to the casino, the firm gained an important member in a banker named Alan Cooper, who helped launder the Krays' money in exchange for protection from a rival gang known as the Richardsons. And with Cooper cooking the books alongside the Krays' financial advisor, a man named Leslie Payne, don't worry, we're going to come back to him later, the place was making money hand over fist. But it wasn't just making the Krays a fortune as a front. Like, Esmeralda's Barn was wildly successful on its own terms. I mean, it's a casino. And it was so successful that the twins were earning close to 6 figures each, which back then, that's an absolute shit ton of money. Charlie Kray described it as a 3-tiered barn of gold, a license to print money. But while the Krays made an absolute fortune off of their patrons' misfortune, they loved it when patrons got carried away and lost a lot more than they had to give. Because then that put them in the Krays' pockets, with a lot of 4-figure debts being written off in exchange for favours, such as the lease of a Kensington flat for the use of a gay lover of Ronnie's. Ronnie was gay, by the way. Ronnie was very gay. He was very, very gay, which was very, very brave to do at the time. But then again, who's going to say anything? He's fucking Ronnie Kray. But I'm sure all of you already knew that. But not all debts were written off, and as you would expect for an establishment run by gangsters, the penalties for late payment were a little bit more than just an angry reminder notice in the mail. In one case, a patron reportedly asked a friend for a £1,500 loan because, and I quote, "If I haven't produced it by 12 o'clock, they're going to cut my tongue out." However, you can only milk a cash cow for so long, and this policy of debt forgiveness, in addition to the fact that the Krays, especially Ronnie, gave tons of credit to their friends, put a serious financial strain on the casino. The Krays' lavish lifestyle and preference for sending a message over making money put the place heavily into debt, which was only exacerbated once Reggie went to jail and Ronnie was left to run the place. Ronnie had a bit of a habit of hiring attractive young men as croupiers and waiters and essentially turning the place into a den of vice for himself and his friends. Business sense be damned. He was such a massive financial liability that Leslie Payne ended up trying to balance the books by offering Ronnie Kray £1,000 a week to fuck off. He literally tried to pay him to go away and let him run the casino because Ronnie was fucking everything up. Ronnie, however, refused because he was having too much fun. And by the time he got bored, he had run the place into the ground, leading to the casino's permanent closure in 1963. But financial issues were only one, albeit large, part of the end of Esmeralda's barn. By that point, the Krays had long outgrown the place, and they were now running 30 nightclubs. So they didn't really need it anymore. Not only were they running a successful criminal empire, but in a move that was more than up to Los Polos standards, they had covered it up with a completely legitimate business empire that was wildly successful in its own right. So successful, in fact, that the clubs ended up becoming more than just a front for their dodgy dealings, but provided both the funding and setting for the Krays' true calling. Clout chasing. You see, it wasn't just gangsters that influenced the Krays lifestyle. For their entire lives, both twins, but especially Ronnie, desperately wanted to be somebody. So they were completely obsessed with and inspired by celebrities, whose company they sought out from the Double R and Esmeralda's barn. The casino in particular brought the Krays into contact with a range of boxing champions and even the likes of Frank Sinatra, Joan Collins and Judy Garland. And the pair were so well acquainted with their celebrity clientele that Reggie even had a fling with Barbara Windsor, who later dated Charlie Kray for 6 months. And she even based her EastEnders character on the Krays' mother, Violet. As you would expect, playing host to such company gave the Krays a massive profile boost, and they ended up becoming celebrities themselves in a weird way. Not only because of their famous friends, but their very carefully managed, larger-than-life and glamorous public persona. They cared so much about their image that they even had a sort of de facto agent in the form of a close family friend named Maureen Flanagan. She had become like a sister to the twins after getting to know the family as their mother's personal stylist. Flanagan would make house calls to cut Violet's hair because she couldn't go to a salon anywhere without being constantly approached and harassed by people who wanted her to ask the Krays to deal with problems for them. As a small-time actress and former Page 3 model, she had a few industry connections that the Krays found very useful. Do you remember Page 3? Who remembers Page 3? I remember Page 3, the glory days of journalism, back when journalism was great and huge and squishy. Look, come on, I like tits. While most crime bosses are scary because they operate anonymously from the shadows, so they don't get fucking caught, the Krays did the exact opposite. As Flanagan put it, the protection racket was their game, but it wasn't just for money. It was for prestige, status. Ronnie loved celebrities. Everything the Krays did was for attention. They were constantly decked out in high-end suits, donating heavily to charity, and being generous to the community, and generally actively courting fame. They even posed for the famous photographer David Bailey, who featured the most iconic picture of the Krays in his book, Bailey's Box of Pin-Ups, alongside the Beatles and other iconic figures of the swinging 60s. But even though he spent a lot of time with the Krays and even became quite friendly with Reggie, he didn't seem to think too much of the amount of attention they had brought to themselves. Despite the veneer of respectability that the Krays worked so hard to maintain, their hands were very, very far from clean. With their hands-on approach to running things, the firm flourished, and the Krays dominated the East End while having the time of their lives as they did so, with Ronnie quoted as saying, "They were the best years of our lives." They called them the swinging 60s. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were the rulers of pop music, Carnaby Street ruled the fashion world, and me and my brother ruled London. We were fucking untouchable. And they really were. Time and time again, the twins would be confronted with the law and they would manage to finesse their way out of any charges either through technicalities or just through sheer influence. The Krays were on top of the world and their influence stripped away certain inhibitions because Ronnie then became fairly open about his homosexuality once he was powerful enough that no one would touch him. Unless he wanted them to, of course. Allegedly, if anyone in the firm said anything about it, Ronnie would just smile and tell them that they didn't know what they were missing. However, despite this somewhat ahead of its time attitude, you could still tell that Ronnie was from the past, because he would also say, "I'm homosexual, but I'm not a Ottoman footstool." if you know what I mean. And speaking of changing attitudes, the Krays were well into the 60s, and you can bet that they took full advantage of all the hedonistic degeneracy that decade had to offer. Until the free love went a little bit too far. While Reggie was rubbing shoulders with celebrities, Ronnie was rubbing something else with a different branch of the elite class. He was friends with a Tory politician named Lord Robert Boothby, and the two were allegedly in a sexual relationship, which is absolutely fucking disgusting. Imagine shagging a Tory. But the real problem with whatever Ronnie and Boothby had going on between them was that the Sunday Mirror had gotten the scoop, and they claimed to have photographic proof of a homosexual relationship between a peer and a prominent gangster. While the two weren't explicitly named, it was pretty obvious who the story was referring to. However, the story never got out there, because it was buried by a libel lawsuit by Boothby that ended up costing the Sunday Mirror £40,000 and cost their editor his job. And the picture of the two men together was explained away as them just simply discussing business. Discussing big, hard, veiny business. But if the story had gotten out at the time, back when being gay was still illegal, the scandal would have been unimaginable. So much so that MI5 got involved and investigated Boothby and Ronnie, with the head of MI5, Roger Hollis, having secret meetings with the Home Secretary about it. The situation was so serious, not because of the gay stuff, but because of Boothby's position. After all, he was a peer, which very nearly made the whole thing one of the worst political sex scandals of all time, on the scale of the Profumo affair only a year prior. In that particular case, the entire government's credibility collapsed after the Secretary of State for War was caught cheating on his wife with a 19-year-old showgirl who was also fucking a Soviet naval attaché. So you can see why Her Majesty's Secret Service were taking this shit very seriously. Ultimately, however, MI5 just left Boothby to it. Because while he was, in the words of the official report, a kinky fellow, I'm not joking, that's literally what the report said about him, he didn't actually have any access to any official secrets. But MI5 got plenty of his. According to declassified MI5 files, he and Ronnie went to homosexual parties together in 1964, where they would wingman for each other, or as MI5 put it, they were hunters of young men. I don't know why I said it like that, but while Boothby and Ronnie did a lot of gay shit together, they probably weren't doing any gay shit together. Because Boothby was actually fucking his chauffeur, who had been provided to him by Ronnie. Despite being gay at an awkward time in history and being caught up in one of the biggest near misses in the history of sex scandals, Ronnie was in the clear as far as his own personal life was concerned. But there was one relationship that he really couldn't tolerate because it stood in the way of by far the most important person in his life. His brother. According to Maureen Flanagan, Ronnie reacted with nothing less than sheer and utter jealousy when Reggie married the sweet and innocent Frances Shea in 1965. Unfortunately, however, the marriage was anything but that. Frances didn't take too long to leave him, with just a diary full of claims of drunken verbal abuse and a failed attempt at annulling the marriage to show for their time together. But ultimately, she stayed married to Reggie for 2 years out of fear of retribution, until the 7th of June 1967, when she committed suicide to get away from him, at the age of only 23. And, as if the marriage wasn't tragic enough, some people believe that Ronnie hated poor Frances so much that he actually killed her. And I'm afraid it only gets darker from here. In January of 1965, the Krays were arrested and charged with trying to shake down a club owner in Soho, with the accusation being that they offered him 2 doormen in return for a cut of the club's earnings. The Krays countered the accusations by asserting that there was no mention of protection when they were in talks with the club owner, and that they were merely seeking investment opportunities for a plan in Nigeria. Despite that sounding ridiculous, the excuse was convincing enough that the trial ended with the jury being unable to reach a verdict. After a retrial, the Krays were eventually acquitted, and less than a month later, they now owned that very same club, and it was renamed to El Morocco. I think we can all guess what happened there. But what was this Nigeria plan that the Krays were allegedly fundraising for? Well, the Krays weren't really in the criminal business. They were in the empire business. And what's an empire without some overseas provinces? Ronnie had teamed up with the son of a Labour politician to help finance the construction of a Nigerian town near Enugu, where people will smile at me and children will dance. I'm sorry, right, but that's one of the funniest fucking scenes in the whole film. But this became something of a passion project for Ronnie, and he was so excited about it that he even spent 3 days in Nigeria, where they rolled out the red carpet for him and gave him the full celebrity treatment, while Leslie Payne was creating holding companies back home for the fundraising and generally doing all of the real work. Ultimately, however, the project fell through after Leslie Payne was detained in Nigeria while trying to get the ball rolling, and the Krays had to bail him out, which left Ronnie feeling very betrayed as the project meant a lot to him. And as the 60s went on, the Krays would become increasingly plagued by misfortune. On the 12th of December 1965, the Krays helped an associate of theirs named Frank Mitchell, also known as the Mad Axeman, escape from Dartmoor prison. However, while laying low, he began to behave very erratically and got increasingly violent, until he eventually vanished without a trace. Gee, I wonder what happened. But this loss of an ally wasn't particularly devastating, because plenty of new friends were about to be made. The American Mafia. Yes, after years of dreaming of being the head of his own Murder Incorporated-esque enterprise, Ronnie got to not only meet his heroes, but to work with them. The firm had made an alliance with the Mafia across the pond, who gave their biggest fans a few pointers on organised criming and some help with expanding their gambling business in the West End. However, there was just one problem. The alliance with the Yanks caused tensions with the rivals at home, especially the Richardson gang, who Ronnie believed were starting to encroach on his territory. And as with most issues that involve the word family, it all came to a head at Christmas. A Richardson henchman named George Cornell called Ronnie a fat Ottoman footstool during a confrontation at the Astor Club, which did exactly what you would expect for Ronnie's temper, and the powder keg of tensions erupted into a gang war. In the ensuing chaos, 2 attempts were made on the Kray twins' lives, and also an ally of the Krays, a man named Richard Hart, was murdered the following March. This angered Ronnie, who flew into a rage, and he put an end to the conflict himself on the 9th of March 1966 by walking right into the Blind Beggar pub on Whitechapel Road, where Cornell and his friends were drinking. Ronnie then pulled out a gun and shot Cornell right in the head in the middle of the day in front of everyone. Ronnie then met up with Reggie and some other members of the firm at another pub half a mile away, where he excitedly told them all what he had just done. Reggie then literally said, "Oh fuck," and ordered everyone to scatter in different cars, later meeting up in the back room of another pub. Because British. The firm then get rid of all of the evidence they could get rid of by burning Ronnie's clothes and also dumping the murder weapon in the River Lee, where it was eventually found years later and put on display in Scotland Yard's Black Museum. However, they couldn't really do anything about the body because the pub's manager had called for an ambulance. Not that it would have really achieved much because it was point blank range, but anyway, when the cops talked to her, even though Cornell was apparently sitting right at the bar when this happened, she somehow didn't see anything at all. In fact, no one else in the pub had saw a thing. When the cops asked one old man why he wasn't talking much, he merely said, "I hate the sight of blood, particularly my own." The cops even arrested Ronnie and put him in a lineup, but that achieved absolutely nothing because the barmaid claimed to have no memory for faces and either couldn't or wouldn't identify Ronnie as the shooter. By this point, Scotland Yard's Inspector Leonard Nipper Reid, so named for being a lightweight boxing champ early in his career, had been after the Krays for years, but he had gotten nowhere, because no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't get past what became known as the Wall of Silence. No one, and I mean no one, would talk to him. In fact, the opposite happened. The cops often received anonymous letters warning them against digging too deep into the Krays and asserting that no one would speak to them. Like this letter that was signed by One Who Knows. "Sir, the 2 Kray brothers are too clever and tricky for you. Certain big people are terrified of these 2. Like everyone in Underworld, London Kray brothers rule and will wrangle out here. They are 2 clever gang leaders, also bullies. They terrify everybody." But it wasn't just the firm that was intimidating witnesses and covering up as much of the murder as possible. The Wall of Silence was so all-encompassing that 2 of Cornell's friends, who were there at the bar and just watched their friends' brains get blown out, wiped all of the fingerprints off of all of the glasses on the bar before they made their way out the back door. After all, they were all criminals too, and even the cops sniffing after their enemies can have really bad consequences for them. And as fucked as it is, I must admit that strolling into a busy pub in broad daylight and shooting someone in the face with no one seeing what happened is pretty baller. It's fucked up, but it's pretty baller. Once all of the work to avoid getting caught was done, that midnight the firm listened to the announcement of Cornell's death on the radio, which was received with cheers, and Ronnie saying, "Always shoot to kill, dead men can't speak." After getting away with Cornell's murder with nothing more than a brick through their window by his vengeful widow, the Krays seemed untouchable, with their massive influence, feats of sheer violence, and the fact that they were clearly fucking mental, keeping everyone under them in line. However, the cracks were starting to show. Reggie was taking on more and more responsibility for running the firm, because Ronnie was getting more and more batshit insane. In a bout of paranoia, Ronnie commissioned a £500 hit on Leslie Payne, the Krays' own accountant, because he was worried that Payne was going to go to the cops and give them information to weasel out of a charge that was hanging over his head. Ronnie went to a gentleman named Jack the Hat McVitie and handed him a gun and £100, and he promised him the rest of the money once the job was done. Ultimately, McVitie didn't go through with it, but he did keep the money that Ron had given him. McVitie's insubordination really pissed off Ronnie, which caused the relationship between the twins and McVitie to completely break down, because in Ronnie's eyes, the only hit that had been carried out was on the Krays' reputation. Unfortunately, this spat eventually ended after McVitie threatened to kill the Krays. Not the smartest thing to say to the Krays.
Why'd you just say that?
So, on the 29th of October 1967, the Krays lured Jack McVitie to a basement flat in Stoke Newington with a fake party invitation. When he arrived, Ronnie pounced on him, and he and 3 associates started beating the absolute shit out of McVitie. McVitie then tried to make a break for it by breaking a window and trying to climb outside, before being dragged back in while begging for his life. Now it was Reggie's turn to finish the job, while being egged on by Ronnie, who allegedly told his brother things like, "Kill him, Reg, do it," and "I've done mine, about time you done yours." Reggie initially tried to shoot McVitie, but the gun malfunctioned. So he stabbed him repeatedly in the face, neck and torso with a carving knife while Ronnie held McVitie in place. Reggie killed McVitie so brutally that some say that McVitie's liver actually fell out and it ended up having to be flushed down the toilet. But we can't know for sure if that actually happened because the body was never recovered. In the aftermath of the McVitie murder, Inspector Nipper Reid finally managed to achieve a breakthrough in the case. You know how Ronnie tried to have Leslie Payne killed because he was worried about him going to the cops? Well, Leslie Payne actually had no intention of doing that whatsoever. Until word got back to him that Ronnie had actually ordered a hit on him, and his alleged hitman had now mysteriously disappeared. This terrified Payne so much that he did then go to the cops for his own protection. Ronnie's bullshit paranoia over nothing had completely fucked both of the brothers over. And it's what actually got the ball rolling on the Krays' demise. And by the time Leslie Payne was done, the cops had 200 pages of testimony. He gave them everything. The only problem was that the cops still needed to corroborate everything, and the wall of silence was so high that Nipper had to reluctantly accept that he needed the assistance of criminals to bring down the Krays. So Nipper embarked on a globe-trotting odyssey down the rabbit hole to hunt down and work with the criminal associates that Payne led him to. Meanwhile, the Krays had eyes and ears everywhere, and they knew exactly what was going on. So they laid low in a Victorian mansion in Suffolk, with Ronnie passing the time by playing with a python that he bought from Harrods. and also attending meetings with his American mob buddies, as well as Alan Cooper, who was Leslie Payne's successor as the Krays financial advisor. After all, cops or no cops, he had businesses to run, and he was in the middle of planning a shake-up that would remake the firm in the image of the American mafia. While the gang of rowdy thugs charging the East End for protection from, well, themselves was doing just fine, Ronnie had greater ambitions. The time for mindless thuggery was over, and Ronnie was ready to step it up a notch. Ronnie ordered Alan Cooper to assassinate a club owner that was a member of a rival gang to try and impress his American buddies, because nothing quite says lying low like having people fucking murked when the cops are just 2 steps behind you. And not only that, but Ronnie really wanted to impress his new mob pals. So he wanted the guy killed with a car bomb. Ronnie was in a position where he desperately needed to avoid any and all attention, so the smart thing to do obviously was have a rival blown up with fucking dynamite. Cooper sent a private radio engineer and alleged hitman Paul Elvey to Glasgow to get the dynamite, where he was then promptly arrested. Nipper Reid then got his hands on him and squeezed out a confession that implicated Cooper in 3 attempted murders. Then, with his back against the wall, Cooper played his trump card. He announced that he was a Fed. Cooper tried to weasel his way out of trouble by claiming to be an undercover agent for the US Treasury Department that was tasked with investigating a connection between the Krays and the American Mafia, and feeding information on the Krays to one of Nipper's bosses. Even though one senior cop called bullshit on that and believed that Cooper was just trying to protect himself, it seemed to pay off, because instead of charging Cooper as an accessory, the cops just recruited him as a witness. Eventually, Nipper had everything he needed to bring down the Krays once and for all. But the real chase was only just beginning. Since the entire case hinged on witness testimony, arresting the Krays was still a very risky move, because if the Krays were able to post bail and get out, everything would fall apart when all of Nipper's witnesses inevitably lost their nerve or started to disappear. But after careful planning, it was finally showtime. On the 8th of May 1968, both Krays and 24 members of the firm were all arrested by a team of almost 100 armed police. With the Krays in custody, the risk of reprisal was eliminated, and the cops were able to guarantee the safety of the witnesses, which suddenly jogged the memory of the barmaid from The Blind Beggar, just in time for the hearing on the 6th of July. And her testimony was enough for the Krays to be put on trial at the Old Bailey the following January, alongside their brother Charlie and a few other members of the firm. What followed was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in British history at the time, where a metric fuckton of the Krays' dirty laundry was aired out in the open by several members of the firm who turned witness and testified against them. Obviously, the police protection and the fact that the Krays were locked up helped dispel any fears of reprisal, but they didn't testify in spite of the Krays' wrath, but because of it. Many ex-members of the firm had come to the exact same conclusions as Leslie Payne had in the wake of McVitie's death, which shattered their loyalty to their former bosses, because they were afraid that they would meet the same fate as McVitie if they stayed on the payroll. So they decided to get the Krays before they got them. The Krays tried to counter all of this by falling back on their public personas, insisting that they were merely philanthropists, with Ronnie frantically name-dropping boxers that he knew for good measure, as if their famous friends could provide character references or something. He even said to the judge, "If I wasn't here, I could be having tea with Judy Garland." Obviously, this tactic didn't pay off, and on the 8th of March 1969, the Krays were convicted of the murders they committed, with Charlie also going down as an accessory to McVitie's murder. But the 10 years that he got was a drop in the ocean compared to what the judge had in store for the Kray twins. He handed them both life sentences of 30 years without parole. And the judge said to them, "In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities." So at the age of only 35, the Krays' careers had been cut short. But they hadn't quite lost everything. Sure, they'd lost their money, influence and gang, but they still had the only thing that truly mattered to them. Clout. As you would expect, the Krays' reputation shot them right to the top of the prison food chain, where their fellow inmates both revered and feared them. However, this status did not stop the Krays' time behind bars from being hell. After spending their entire lives together, the brothers were housed separately, which Reggie took so badly that his mental health tanked and he attempted suicide, which led to a successful petition by Maureen Flanagan to get the twins reunited in 1972. Flanagan dutifully visited both of the twins often and funded Ronnie's £7,000 commissary bill by selling on little bits of information he would give her to the papers. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know that commissary is expensive and prison work is cheap, but how the fuck did he manage to rack up a £7,000 tab? Well, it was because Ronnie was committed to Broadmoor in July of 1979, which isn't a prison, it is a secure psychiatric hospital, the most notorious one in the entire country. This meant that Ronnie was allowed to have food and other small things ordered in from the outside world. But not from the corner shop down the road. Ronnie made them shop at fucking Harrods.
They said market price. What market are you shopping at?
However, while Ronnie's appetite for luxury continued as if nothing at all had happened, his transfer to Broadmoor was essentially the final nail for the myth of the Kray twins. The two were separated for the rest of their lives, and this final break in what was practically a symbiotic relationship reportedly hit Reggie very hard. In 1982, medical reports described him as sallow, drawn, looking very worried and concerned, had lost his confidence and was clearly upset, which was a depressingly vast departure from what they once called the lively, humorous East Ender that they once knew. Reggie still got to visit with his brother in Broadmoor on a regular basis, but whenever the twins were reunited, it was weird. Reportedly, the two would barely talk to each other at all during these visits, and observers claimed that they appeared to have some sort of telepathic connection. Now, I know that sounds weird and it probably is a giant pile of bullshit, but twins do very often seem to be more in sync with each other than most other people. So, I can't really say for sure what was going on there. Joseph Mengele would probably know. But while the twins weren't happy with their new lot in life, they couldn't just sit around and sulk for their entire sentence. They still had money to make. In 1988, the Krays wrote an autobiography together that was titled Our Story, in addition to a solo autobiography each in subsequent years. However, by no means did the Krays have a monopoly on telling their story. Many biographies have been written over the years, but there was one biographer that arguably knew the Krays much better than any other. John Pearson had known the twins since becoming their biographer in 1967, after Truman Capote turned them down. Because, of course, they tried to get Truman Capote to write their life story. Also, just another little fun fact, Reggie Kray wrote another book called A Way of Life, and the reason that I know about that book is when I was in jail, for the whole Nazi pug thing, you might have heard one or two things about that. One thing that a lot of people don't know is whenever you're in the jail, you have a right to a book. You can ask the guard for a book. If the guard is nice, the guard will let you choose from a selection, or if the guard is a complete dick, he'll just bring you the first book he sees. But I was allowed to choose from the trolley, and the book I chose was A Way of Life by Reggie Kray. But just to get back on track, Pearson alleged that the Krays kept more than just business within the family, saying that Ronnie had confessed to the teenage incest in an interview, though Pearson waited until well after both twins had died before telling the world about this for obvious reasons. But personally, I still think it's a lot of shite. One of the 3 biographies that Pearson wrote is actually among the most popular books in British prisons, second only to the Bible, which was so popular that Reggie must have gotten his hands on one because he found Christ while on the inside. Some people, however, saw his conversion as a cynical attempt to curry favour with the parole board because no Home Secretary was willing to consider his release. Though some letters that Reggie had written to a pen pal about his newfound faith did actually seem sincere. But that doesn't mean that Reggie kept his nose completely clean while waiting to be eligible for parole. In 1985, Broadmoor Hospital staff discovered a business card that was in Ronnie's possession, and it read, "Personal aids to the Hollywood stars." Despite being incarcerated, and separately, no less, the Krays were running a company. Their little venture was called Krays Enterprises, which provided celebrities with private security, and it was managed on the outside by their brother Charlie. Naturally, the police investigated the company, but they could find no legal reason to shut it down. It was actually just a legitimate private security company. They even had an old acquaintance as a client. Frank Sinatra once hired 18 bodyguards from them when he went to watch Wimbledon. Thanks to their side hustle and getting Maureen Flanagan to sell lore to the press, the Krays really seemed to want for nothing while on the inside, including company. Despite being a very out and proud gay man, Ronnie married 2 women for some reason. The first was a former topless kissogram and 2-time divorcee named Elaine Mildener, who he married in 1985. She does not sound like one to bring home to meet the mother. Because, as you would expect from the state of her romantic history and career, Ronnie was not able to fix her, and the couple were divorced in 1989. However, while the marriage was a bust, it wasn't a total loss. Maureen Flanagan helped Ronnie sell the media rights to their wedding for 20 grand, though he ultimately only got paid 10. And after the marriage inevitably fell apart, Ronnie married Kate Howard that same year, with the nuptials coming with another big check from the media. Though that marriage itself only lasted until 1994. In their obsessive quest to milk their image for all of the cash it was worth, the next step for the Krays was selling the movie rights to their story, leading to a biopic being released in 1990 titled The Krays. The deal netted the 3 Krays brothers £255,000, with Charlie acting as a consultant. But they ended up being very unhappy with the final result, because in the film, their mother used the phrase, "bollocks to the lot of you." And their mother didn't swear. Ever. Big Mama Kray never ever used bad language. And the Krays were actually really pissed off about that. Despite the fact that the Krays seemed to have made it while in prison, there was a surprising amount of sympathy and calls for their release from the general public. And it wasn't even a case of hybristophilia or morons looking at them through rose-tinted glasses because of their celebrity status and mythos. Many regular people just genuinely had a great amount of respect for the Kray twins because, to them, they were pillars of the community. After all, they had only committed crimes against other criminals, and their supporters claimed that the streets of London were a lot safer for women and children with the Krays around. A number of members of the public even saw the Krays' downfall as little more than a show trial due to the harshness of their sentences, which were perceived to be very excessive, considering the lighter sentences that other people had received for much worse crimes. Personally, I think the harsh sentences were in light of all the shit that the cops knew the Krays were doing, but just couldn't prove. They just wanted to get them off the street for as long as possible because they knew that as soon as they got out, they would just try and rule London again. At least, I think that may be why. That's a debate in and of itself, and this video is already long enough. But anyway, all of this public support for the Krays' release culminated in a rally in Hyde Park in 1993, where hundreds of people marched to Downing Street with a petition that had 10,000 signatures. However, not everyone agreed. While the fact that the Krays never dealt in narcotics was seen as a positive, many believe that the reason they didn't get involved in drugs is because during the 60s, they just weren't that profitable. In the 60s in America, oh fuck yeah, they were profitable. They were very, very profitable, but the whole hippie subculture, it just wasn't really a thing in Britain, which is why drugs didn't really take off here until much later. Also, the idea that the Krays made the East End safer, well, that went far from unchallenged, with a wide belief that if they hadn't been caught, the Krays' violence would have inevitably escalated to the point where they crossed the line and started hurting members of the public. After all, look at the murders they committed. Cornell and McVitie weren't killed for profit or self-preservation. They were killed so the Krays could flex their own power and prestige. Despite the public debate over his release, freedom just wasn't on the cards for Ronnie Kray. On the 17th of March 1995, he died of a heart attack at the age of 61, likely as a result of his 100-a-day smoking habit. Reggie was distraught, obviously, after reportedly hearing about his brother's death from a fellow inmate who heard it over the radio that morning. And Reggie was so badly affected that many who knew him said that, in a way, he had also died that day. But, as a small consolation, he was temporarily released from prison to say goodbye to his brother at his funeral, which was attended by 60,000 people. Despite having lost his brother, Reggie wasn't completely without companionship for his final years. In 1997, he remarried after meeting a woman named Roberta Jones, because for some reason, bitches just fucking love violent criminals. But the universe couldn't let the Krays have it too good for too long, and in June of 1997, their brother Charlie was charged with trying to smuggle £39 million worth of cocaine into Britain, and then he was convicted after he offered to sell it to 2 undercover police officers. He ended up getting a 12-year sentence. Like most criminals that get caught, Charlie insisted profusely that he was innocent, saying, "All my life I have advised people, particularly young people, never to be involved in drugs. I swear on my son's life that I never handled drugs in my life. The juries have got it wrong for me before, and this jury has got it wrong now." Nevertheless, despite being sentenced to 12 years at the age of 70, his partner was very optimistic that Charlie was tough enough to make it out of the other end of this sentence and get busy living. He did not get busy living. He got busy dying on the 4th of April in the year 2000. In 1998, Reggie Kray came to the end of his mandatory 30 years in prison, and he became eligible for parole. However, his application was rejected because he was deemed a devious and manipulative personality. Nevertheless, while the parole board didn't like Reggie very much, he still seemed to have friends in high places, as his associations with celebrities continued. At one point, Mike Tyson actually considered visiting Reggie during his trip to the UK, but ultimately pulled out because he felt like it would tarnish his image. Not that he had much of an image around about that time. Zoomers won't remember, but back in the 90s, Mike Tyson was a very different person. Without his celebrity chums to keep him occupied, Reggie had to find his own entertainment, and he got into drawing in 1999. And he certainly had potential, I think. But I think that it was actually more his signatures on the artwork that made them worthy of being auctioned off, instead of his artistic prowess. In addition to the drawings, other Krays memorabilia that was auctioned off included letters and a boxing glove that was given to Reggie by Rocky Marciano. Eventually, Reggie finally received his ticket to freedom in August of the year 2000, except the gates he was heading towards were not the prison ones. He had been diagnosed with terminal bladder cancer, and he was released from prison on compassionate grounds. Probably too little too late, but hey-ho. Either way, in true Krays fashion, feeling sunlight again wasn't enough, and Reggie couldn't resist one last moment in the spotlight. A BBC interview that he gave from his deathbed where he made one last confession. When he was asked if he was denied parole for so long for having killed someone else, Reggie said yes. But instead of clearing his conscience, Reggie chose to leave the world hanging by refusing to name the victim. Reggie's last message to the world also included a warning against getting into a life of crime, because prison sucks, it turns out. And as he put it, prison life is a waste of time. I get letters from all over the country and I advise kids, it's very difficult when kids have nothing to do and no money and all kinds of social problems out there. So, it's easier to say than it is done. But speaking from my heart to them, I would like to see them stay out of prison. Some will make it, some won't. However, despite this warning, Reggie admitted that he had no regrets whatsoever about killing Jack the Hat, and he stood by his actions until he died on the 1st of October in the year 2000, at the age of 66. 10 days later, 2,500 people turned up to pay their respects at his funeral, where the hearse was pulled by 6 black horses and decked out with flowers arranged to say "Free at Last" and "Reg Beloved." The burial itself was a much more intimate affair, with just 200 attendees at the family plot in Chingford Mount Cemetery in northeast London. The service focused on Reggie's born-again Christianity instead of his criminal history, with his lawyer saying nice things about him, which, the lawyer, of course, is going to say a lot of nice things about him. He would have definitely made a lot of money from Reggie. But some of the nice things that he said included things like, Reg was an icon of the 20th century, a man who had the ability to draw attention from the outside world, and I have first-hand knowledge of his kindness and generosity. Yeah, I bet you did. Finally, Reggie was reunited with Ronnie as his casket was lowered into the ground next to his, with Frank Sinatra's My Way playing him out and a stone marking where the Krays twins rest that reads, "Grant them eternal rest, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them." Even though Reggie's wife was by his side when he died, he might not have actually returned her devotion. In 2002, a former prisoner named Bradley Allardyce that knew Reggie on the inside revealed on Radio 4 that he wasn't just Reggie's friend. He was also his lover, which was a relationship that both men had denied for a very long time. Allegedly, this relationship seemed to lead to some pretty interesting pillow talk between the two convicts, as Allardyce became quite a close confidant. So close that Reggie reportedly confessed something pretty huge to him. Ronnie had apparently killed Reggie's wife, Frances, by forcing her to take the pills that killed her. And then he told Reggie about it 2 days later. Now, while that probably isn't very surprising, it's still really, really fucked up if it's true. But in a way, I suppose it's a real testament to just how close the two twins were, because I can't imagine anyone else continuing to have a relationship with their brother, especially after they just confessed to killing their wife. But bros before hoes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not even doing multiple takes anymore. I've been filming. This happens every single time I do a massive video. I'm tired and I want to go home now. The deaths of the Kray twins ended up being a pretty big deal because nothing heralds the end of a century quite like the passing of some of its biggest icons. With the sands of time, I've got hiccups now. You know what? I don't care. I'm just gonna fucking keep going. With the sands of time stripping away everything they've built. While the blind beggar has done very well for itself over the years and become quite famous as the pub where George Cornell was murdered, I don't care anymore. I'm not doing any more takes. I want to go home. As the pub where George Cornell was murdered, neither the Double R or Esmeralda's Barn exist anymore. Both buildings have long since been demolished. The head of security at Reggie's funeral summed it up quite aptly when he said, "It's the end of an era. When we close the chapter, it is sad. I think this is the end of the whole Kray illusion." And I think that it's quite likely that the Krays legend really was just a bit of an illusion, because at the end of the day, they were kind of stupid. I'm sorry, some of the stuff, I mean, if you're a boss, you don't do hits yourself. You don't do the hits yourself there, getting your hands and DNA and fingerprints absolutely all over everything. Right, I don't know, and the business decisions, yeah, they were kind of dumb. I mean, sure, Reggie had a ridiculous gift. I don't care, I'm not doing more takes. Gift for PR, and Ronnie really didn't make business easy for him. But much of the brains of the operation actually came from Charlie Kray and Leslie Payne. Considering how they did very little to conduct themselves with any kind of subtlety, it's honestly a bit of a miracle that the Kray twins managed to coast through their criminal careers for as long as they did. I mean, just look at how everything they built imploded the second they left the picture. Unlike the mafia families that they tried so hard to emulate, which are still going strong a century after they were founded. Even other gangsters weren't fans of the Krays and dismissed them as nothing more than affectatious thugs that surrounded themselves with too many dodgy characters. They even called the Krays thieves, ponces, and they also called them Gert and Daisy behind their backs. And I'm assuming that Ronnie was Daisy because gay. It certainly wasn't lost on Reggie, who reflected later in life that he and Ronnie may have actually been celebrated if they had made different choices in life. After all, a very common complaint among pretty much everyone is that criminals have no class anymore. And here were the Kray twins, dressed to the nines and schmoozing with Frank Sinatra at the epicentre of the trendiness brought about by the swinging 60s. They were so much larger than life that it's no wonder they became just as iconic as the archetypal gangsters and celebrities that they worshipped and emulated. Nevertheless, regardless of how you or I see them or what the truth really is, you can't deny that the Krays had one hell of a ride. After all, they're such captivating figures that to this day we're still making countless documentaries and adaptations of the Krays story. Most notably, 2015's Legend starring Tom Hardy, which, go watch it, it's a phenomenal movie by the way. And I do think the title is warranted. Despite essentially being the Paul brothers of the gangster world, the Krays managed to use marketing genius and shameless attention-seeking to make themselves legends of British culture, both as celebrities and as gangsters. If not for anything else, you have to respect the hustle. You know what they say, the world's a stage, and the Krays made the most of their time in the spotlight. This has been another very long video, and I'm going to go home now.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody should subscribe.